In 1991, one of the most powerful empires in modern history vanished in a matter of days, without a major war, without foreign invasion, and without a single defining battle. The Soviet Union, a superpower that once stretched across 1/6 of the Earth's landmass and shaped the course of the 20th century, simply ceased to exist. How does a system so vast, so centralized, and so deeply rooted collapse so completely and so quickly? This is the complete story of how it happened. Let's begin. In the spring of 1945, the guns of the Second World War fell silent. The most destructive conflict in human history had finally come to an end. Europe lay in ruins, tens of millions were dead, and the old world order was broken. Out of this devastation, two powers stood above all others, the United States and the Soviet Union. For the Soviet Union, the war had come at a staggering cost. An estimated 27 million Soviet citizens had died. Entire cities were destroyed, farmland scorched, and infrastructure reduced to rubble. Yet despite the suffering, the Soviet Union emerged victorious, having played a decisive role in defeating Nazi Germany. In May of 1945, the Red Army marched through Berlin, its flag raised over the ruins of the Reichstag. The message was clear. The Soviet Union was not only a survivor, it was now a global superpower. Under the leadership of Joseph Stalin, the USSR quickly began reshaping the post-war world in its image. The Red Army, already positioned across Eastern Europe, helped install communist regimes in countries such as Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, and East Germany. These governments were politically aligned with Moscow and economically dependent on it. This new bloc of states formed a protective buffer zone between the Soviet Union and Western Europe, a strategic move rooted in both ideology and security concerns. Stalin, who had long feared encirclement by hostile powers, now controlled a wide belt of allied nations stretching across the European continent. This expansion was not achieved through formal annexation, but through influence, pressure, and carefully managed local revolutions. The West, especially the United States and Great Britain, watched these developments with growing unease. By 1947, Winston Churchill had famously described an iron curtain descending across Europe. The world was entering a new period of tension and rivalry, the Cold War. At home, Stalin's regime focused on reconstruction and consolidation. The Soviet Union had to rebuild its shattered economy while maintaining control over its newly expanded sphere of influence. The state launched the Fourth Five-Year Plan in 1946, aiming to restore pre-war production levels. The plan emphasized heavy industry, steel, coal, and military production. Consumer goods and agriculture remained secondary. The results were mixed. Industrial output recovered quickly, but the population continued to face shortages and hardship. The post-war years also saw the continuation of political repression. Stalin's control remained absolute. Any form of dissent, real or imagined, was met with surveillance, imprisonment, or worse. The secret police, under the control of Lavrenti Beria, maintained a tight grip on the population. Even returning Soviet prisoners of war were treated with suspicion. Many were sent to labor camps, accused of collaboration simply for having been captured by the enemy. Ideologically, the Soviet Union portrayed itself as the vanguard of socialism and the defender of the working class. It offered an alternative model to Western capitalism, one that promised equality, industrial progress, and state-planned development. In reality, however, the Soviet system remained highly centralized, rigid, and resistant to innovation. Yet during the immediate post-war years, its influence was growing rapidly. In Asia, the Soviets played a key role in the defeat of Japan by invading Manchuria in August of 1945. They occupied parts of Korea, setting the stage for the eventual division of the peninsula into North and South Korea. In China, the Soviet Union supported the Chinese Communist Party, which would soon take power in Beijing. Moscow's reach was extending far beyond Europe. The late 1940s marked the beginning of a bipolar world. In response to the perceived threat of Soviet expansion, the United States launched the Marshall Plan in 1948, offering economic aid to rebuild Western Europe. The Soviet Union rejected the plan and forbade its allies from participating, fearing Western influence. Instead, Moscow established the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or CUMCON, as a separate economic bloc. In 1949, NATO was formed as a military alliance against Soviet power. That same year, the Soviet Union successfully tested its first atomic bomb, breaking the American monopoly on nuclear weapons. The balance of power was now clear. The Soviet Union stood as one of two global giants with its own military alliances, its own economic system, and a vast sphere of political control. But the seeds of future problems were already present. The rapid militarization and prioritization of heavy industry came at the expense of living standards. While the USSR could produce tanks and rockets, it struggled to provide enough meat, clothing, or housing for its people. The centralized planning system lacked flexibility and punished innovation. Nonetheless, the superpower image, complete with parades, missile launches, and scientific triumphs, was maintained through propaganda and strict censorship. Stalin's cult of personality continued to grow in the post-war years. His image was everywhere, in classrooms, factories, and public buildings. He was credited not only with leading the USSR to victory in war, but also with guiding it through the challenges of peace. Few dared question his authority. As one Soviet citizen later recalled, "We didn't think about politics, we didn't talk about it. You just kept your head down." But not all was quiet beneath the surface. Ethnic tensions, economic disparities, and suppressed political opinions were simmering. In the occupied Eastern European states, resentment toward Soviet control would soon begin to surface. Within the USSR, the forced collectivization of earlier decades had left lasting scars, particularly in Ukraine and the Caucasus. And in Moscow, the concentration of power in the hands of one man had created a brittle political structure with no clear path for transition. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died in his dacha just outside Moscow. His death marked the end of an era. For nearly 30 years, Stalin had ruled the Soviet Union with absolute authority. His policies had shaped every aspect of Soviet life, its politics, economy, culture, and foreign policy. Now, with his passing, the question loomed large. What would happen to the system he had built? There was no clear plan for succession. Stalin had never named a formal heir, and his inner circle was filled with men who had survived by keeping their ambitions hidden. In the days immediately following his death, a collective leadership emerged, composed of senior Communist Party figures, including Georgy Malenkov, Lavrentiy Beria, Vyacheslav Molotov, and Nikita Khrushchev. Each man represented different interests within the party and state apparatus. None could immediately dominate the others. The initial power vacuum was filled by a temporary arrangement. Malenkov took over as premier, Beria controlled the security services, and Khrushchev at first held a lower-profile position as party secretary. But behind the scenes, power struggles were already underway. Each leader knew that control of the party, the heart of the Soviet system, would ultimately determine who prevailed. In the months following Stalin's death, the new leadership began a cautious process of de-escalation. One of the earliest and most surprising shifts came from Beria, the feared head of the secret police. Seeking to distance himself from Stalin's repressive legacy, Beria called for reforms. He released thousands of political prisoners, spoke against forced Russification in the republics, and hinted at the possibility of liberalizing policies toward Eastern Europe. For many, this was the first glimpse of change after decades of fear. But Beria's influence and past crimes made him dangerous. By mid-1953, his rivals had seen enough. In June of that year, Beria was arrested in a dramatic move led by Khrushchev and supported by key military officers. He was executed later that year after a secret trial. With Beria gone, the balance shifted decisively. Over the next 2 years, Nikita Khrushchev gradually consolidated power. Unlike the gray bureaucrats surrounding him, Khrushchev was blunt, energetic, and politically agile. He understood that the Soviet system could not continue under the exact same methods that Stalin had employed. At the 20th Party Congress in February of 1956, Khrushchev stunned the communist world with a speech that would become known as the secret speech. In this speech, delivered behind closed doors to party delegates, Khrushchev denounced Stalin's cult of personality, his purges, and the atmosphere of terror he had created. He acknowledged that thousands of loyal communists had been executed or imprisoned under false charges. "Comrades," he said, "we must have the courage to look truth in the face." The speech was not made public immediately, but its contents quickly spread throughout the USSR and beyond. This act of political courage, or calculated risk, had major consequences. Within the Soviet Union, it triggered a partial thaw. Political prisoners continued to be released and censorship was eased slightly. In literature and the arts, a period known as the Khrushchev thaw began. Writers such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn were allowed to publish works that criticized aspects of Soviet life, albeit within limits. Abroad, however, the reaction was more volatile. The most dramatic consequence came in Hungary in October of 1956. Inspired by hopes of reform and emboldened by the perception that Moscow might tolerate change, Hungarian protesters demanded greater freedom and the withdrawal of Soviet troops. For a brief moment, it seemed a revolution might succeed. But when the Hungarian government announced plans to leave the Warsaw Pact, the Soviet response was swift. Troops and tanks invaded Budapest, crushing the uprising and killing thousands. Reform had limits, and those limits were clearly drawn by the Kremlin. Back home, Khrushchev's position grew stronger. By 1958, he had removed his main rivals and assumed the post of premier in addition to leading the party. Yet his leadership style was erratic. He pushed for rapid industrial development, proposed wild schemes such as planting maize across the USSR, and attempted to decentralize economic planning through regional councils. Many of his reforms confused officials and disrupted the existing bureaucratic structure. One of Khrushchev's most ambitious and problematic initiatives was the Virgin Lands campaign. Beginning in 1954, the government encouraged millions of people, especially young Komsomol volunteers, to move to Kazakhstan and other republics to cultivate previously unused land. In the short term, grain production increased. But over time, poor planning, soil erosion, and inadequate infrastructure led to declining yields and disillusionment. In foreign policy, Khrushchev was bold but inconsistent. He championed peaceful coexistence with the West, yet also engaged in provocative actions like the Berlin Crisis and the Cuban Missile Crisis. In October of 1962, the world came closer to nuclear war than ever before, as Soviet missiles in Cuba were discovered by American reconnaissance planes. A tense standoff followed, ultimately resolved through secret negotiations between Khrushchev and American President John F. Kennedy. While war was avoided, the crisis damaged Khrushchev's credibility at home and abroad. By the early 1960s, dissatisfaction with Khrushchev's leadership was growing within the party elite. His attempts to reform agriculture and reorganize the party alienated many officials. His public outbursts and unpredictable decisions embarrassed colleagues. In October of 1964, while Khrushchev was vacationing, a group of senior officials orchestrated his removal. He was replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, a more cautious and traditional figure. Khrushchev's removal marked a turning point. The leadership that followed him would not challenge the core structure of Soviet power in the same way. The reforms he attempted were halted or reversed. Yet his time in office left a lasting mark. He had exposed Stalin's crimes, introduced a measure of political openness, and tried, however imperfectly, to adapt the system to a changing world. But the deeper structure of the Soviet state remained frozen. The Communist Party still held total control. Economic planning was rigid and inefficient. Dissent was tolerated only up to a point, and fear of foreign influence continued to shape policy. Even after Stalin's death, the system he had forged, centralized, authoritarian, resistant to criticism, proved remarkably durable. By the late 1950s, the Soviet Union was in a state of transition. Under Nikita Khrushchev's leadership, some of the most tightly held controls of the Stalinist era were beginning to loosen. There was a new sense of possibility in Soviet society, particularly in the realms of culture, science, and public discourse. Khrushchev's policies of de-Stalinization and modest liberalization, collectively known as the thaw, created both hope and uncertainty. But alongside these efforts at reform came significant political volatility, strategic missteps, and growing internal resistance. By the mid-1960s, Khrushchev's own authority would collapse under the weight of his inconsistent governance. Khrushchev's rise to power was built on a promise to reshape the legacy of Stalin without dismantling the communist system itself. While his secret speech in 1956 opened the door to acknowledging past abuses, it also triggered unease within the ruling elite. Many party members had built their careers under Stalin and feared exposure or backlash. Others worried that the ideological clarity and discipline of earlier years were being sacrificed in pursuit of popularity. Nonetheless, Khrushchev pressed forward. In foreign policy, he promoted the idea of peaceful coexistence between socialism and capitalism. He sought to reduce the constant tension of the early Cold War years, though this approach was often contradicted by aggressive displays of Soviet strength. In 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world by launching Sputnik, the first artificial satellite. It was a symbolic and strategic victory, showcasing the USSR's technological capabilities. The space race had begun, and for a moment, the Soviet Union held the lead. The success of Sputnik led to a surge in national pride and boosted Khrushchev's standing at home and abroad. It demonstrated that the Soviet model, despite its flaws, could produce major scientific achievements. The victory also prompted increased investment in science and education, particularly in physics and engineering. Soviet children were encouraged to become scientists, and universities expanded their technical programs. But achievements in space were not matched by progress on Earth. Khrushchev faced persistent problems in the Soviet economy. His attempts to reform agriculture and industry were ambitious, but often counterproductive. One of his most notable policies, the Virgin Lands campaign, had begun in the mid-1950s with early enthusiasm. By encouraging cultivation of vast tracts of land in Kazakhstan and Siberia, Khrushchev hoped to resolve chronic grain shortages. Yet the results were uneven. Initial harvests were strong, but poor planning, soil depletion, and lack of infrastructure soon led to declining output. Dust storms swept across the steppes, and once promising settlements were abandoned. Khrushchev also sought to break up the central ministries that managed the economy. He replaced them with regional councils, believing this would reduce bureaucracy and improve efficiency. Instead, it created confusion and power struggles between local and central authorities. Managers often lacked clear guidance, and many resisted changes that threatened their status. The housing sector saw one of Khrushchev's more enduring legacies. To address urban overcrowding, his government launched a massive campaign to build low-cost apartment blocks known as Khrushchevkas. These 5-story concrete buildings were functional and standardized. Though often cramped and monotonous, they offered private apartments to millions of families for the first time. The shift from communal living to private space represented a quiet but significant change in Soviet daily life. Culturally, the Khrushchev era opened space for new voices. Writers, filmmakers, and artists explored themes previously off-limits. Novels such as One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich by Alexander Solzhenitsyn depicted life in Stalin's labor camps, offering a glimpse into the darker side of Soviet history. While censorship still existed, there was more room for discussion, satire, and social critique than ever before in Soviet history. Yet this cultural openness had limits. When expression challenged the authority of the Communist Party or questioned the legitimacy of the Soviet system itself, the state responded harshly. Writers and intellectuals who crossed the line were silenced, exiled, or imprisoned. The tension between openness and control became a defining feature of the era. On the international stage, Khrushchev's leadership was marked by dramatic episodes that oscillated between diplomacy and confrontation. In 1959, he became the first Soviet leader to visit the United States, engaging in a public tour and a now famous debate with Vice President Richard Nixon. The visit aimed to soften the Soviet image, but ideological differences remained stark. The early 1960s brought rising tensions in Europe and the Americas. In 1961, the construction of the Berlin Wall began, dividing the city and symbolizing the deepening divide between East and West. Later that year, Khrushchev faced a major crisis when the Soviet military placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, provoking a direct confrontation with the United States. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Ultimately, both sides reached a negotiated settlement, and the Soviet missiles were withdrawn. While the crisis was averted, many in the Soviet leadership saw Khrushchev's handling of the affair as reckless. Domestically, Khrushchev's leadership style became increasingly erratic. He often made major policy decisions without consultation, reshuffled government positions frequently, and shifted focus from one initiative to another without clear direction. His unpredictable behavior frustrated colleagues and undermined administrative stability. By 1964, discontent within the Communist Party had reached a breaking point. A group of senior officials, including Leonid Brezhnev, Alexei Kosygin, and Mikhail Suslov, quietly organized his removal. While Khrushchev was on vacation, the Central Committee voted to depose him. He was forced into retirement and given a modest pension. In a final address to the party, Khrushchev acknowledged his failures, saying, "I'm glad I was able to do something good. I'm sorry about the mistakes." His removal was swift and bloodless, a contrast to the brutal purges of earlier decades. It marked the end of a turbulent yet formative chapter in Soviet history. Khrushchev had attempted to humanize socialism, to modernize the economy, and to open space for cultural expression. But his reforms lacked consistency, and his leadership lacked discipline. In the years that followed, the party elite took careful steps to avoid similar instability. Khrushchev's successor, Leonid Brezhnev, promised a return to order and collective leadership. The new regime sought to preserve what it saw as the gains of socialism while avoiding further disruptions. When Leonid Brezhnev took power in October of 1964, the Soviet Union was entering a period that would be defined by predictability, order, and quiet decline. Brezhnev, along with his allies in the Politburo, promised to bring stability after the turbulence of Nikita Khrushchev's erratic leadership. For a time, it worked. But beneath the surface, the system was ossifying. What would later be called the era of stagnation began not with crisis, but with calm, a calm that gradually hardened into paralysis. Brezhnev's style of governance contrasted sharply with that of his predecessor. He avoided bold reforms or sweeping declarations, preferring consensus and bureaucratic control. Power became increasingly centralized in a small, aging circle of party elites. Political turnover slowed dramatically. Once appointed to high office, officials remained in place for decades. The Soviet leadership became known for its gerontocracy, rule by the elderly, often mocked by citizens in quiet jokes told behind closed doors. In economic policy, Brezhnev sought stability rather than innovation. The five-year plans continued to emphasize heavy industry, defense production, and energy development. The Soviet Union became one of the world's largest producers of oil and natural gas, which provided a steady stream of export revenue, especially during the oil crises of the 1970s. But despite this windfall, the overall economy began to stagnate. Agricultural productivity remained low, despite increasing subsidies and mechanization. The state continued to purchase grain from abroad, including from the United States and Canada, to make up for domestic shortfalls. Consumer goods remained limited, and everyday shortages persisted across the country. Long lines, ration cards, and empty shelves became a routine part of Soviet life. What made this economic stagnation particularly damaging was its quiet nature. There was no major collapse or sudden downturn. Instead, growth slowed gradually and inefficiencies multiplied. State factories continued to meet production quotas, but often through wasteful or deceptive means. Quality was sacrificed for quantity. Managers would meet targets by stockpiling useless goods or inflating figures. The central planning apparatus, too rigid to adapt, failed to correct these distortions. At the same time, corruption became endemic. The Soviet black market, known as the second economy, grew in response to shortages. Bribery, favoritism, and theft of state property became common. While the system projected an image of equality and order, daily life often depended on informal networks, connections, and quiet deals. Despite these domestic weaknesses, the Soviet Union projected an image of strength abroad. Its military expanded steadily under Brezhnev, becoming one of the most powerful in the world. The doctrine of strategic parity with the United States became a guiding principle of foreign policy. The USSR achieved nuclear equality and maintained a global presence through alliances, aid, and ideological partnerships. In Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union continued to enforce its control with both subtle pressure and overt force. The most dramatic example came in Czechoslovakia in 1968. That year, under the leadership of Alexander Dubček, the country embarked on a series of liberalizing reforms known as the Prague Spring. The government allowed greater freedom of speech, loosened censorship, and proposed a model of socialism with a human face. Moscow viewed these reforms as a threat to the unity of the Warsaw Pact and to the ideological foundations of the Soviet Bloc. In August of that year, Soviet and other Warsaw Pact troops invaded Czechoslovakia and crushed the movement. Brezhnev soon articulated what became known as the Brezhnev Doctrine, the principle that the USSR had the right to intervene in any socialist country where socialism was seen to be under threat. This doctrine would remain a cornerstone of Soviet policy for the next 2 decades. Under Brezhnev, the Soviet Union also increased its engagement in the developing world. It provided military and economic support to client states and liberation movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. Angola, Ethiopia, Vietnam, and Cuba all received Soviet backing. The Kremlin viewed these efforts as part of a broader ideological struggle against Western imperialism and as a way to expand global influence. One of the most important arenas of Soviet foreign policy during this period was détente, the effort to ease tensions with the United States. Beginning in the early 1970s, both superpowers signed a series of arms control agreements, including the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. Trade increased and cultural exchanges took place. For a time, it seemed that a more stable and less confrontational phase of the Cold War was possible. But détente had limits. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December of 1979 marked a decisive break. In support of a struggling communist government in Kabul, the Red Army entered Afghanistan, expecting a short intervention. Instead, it became a long, costly war with no clear victory. The United States responded by boycotting the 1980 Moscow Olympics and increasing support for Afghan resistance fighters. The conflict would continue for nearly a decade and become a major drain on Soviet resources and morale. Back at home, the contrast between the Soviet Union's global ambitions and its domestic stagnation was growing more apparent. Life expectancy stopped increasing. Alcoholism became more widespread. The education system still produced highly trained scientists and engineers, but innovation slowed, and the application of research was often limited by bureaucratic constraints. Culture under Brezhnev was carefully managed. The state tolerated a narrow range of expression while cracking down on dissent. Writers such as Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who had been allowed to publish under Khrushchev, were now silenced or exiled. Dissidents faced surveillance, imprisonment, or confinement in psychiatric hospitals. Independent thought, even if not overtly political, was treated with suspicion. One example of quiet resistance came from the growing underground circulation of banned books, music, and films. Known as samizdat, this system allowed forbidden material to be copied and passed by hand from person to person. While the scale was limited, it kept alive alternative voices and created a shadow culture that defied official narratives. Brezhnev himself became a symbol of the system's rigidity. As he aged, he became less active, delegating more to his inner circle. His speeches grew slower and less coherent, and his physical health deteriorated. Yet he remained in office until his death in November of 1982. By that time, he had led the Soviet Union for 18 years, longer than any leader except Stalin. Brezhnev's death marked the beginning of a rapid succession of elderly and ailing leaders. Yuri Andropov and Konstantin Chernenko each served for only a short time before their deaths. These years reinforced the image of a leadership out of touch with its population, clinging to power without vision or vitality. The era of stagnation left the Soviet Union with a number of unresolved problems: a bloated bureaucracy, a slowing economy, a disillusioned population, and an inflexible political system. The appearance of strength masked deep weaknesses. When change finally came, it would be from a new generation of leaders, those who had grown up after the revolution and who saw that the old ways could no longer sustain the future. In December of 1979, Soviet tanks crossed the border into Afghanistan. What began as a calculated intervention to support a struggling communist government soon spiraled into one of the most damaging and drawn-out conflicts in Soviet history. The war in Afghanistan would not only strain the USSR's military and economy, but also erode public trust, alienate international allies, and expose the rigid limits of Soviet foreign policy. For many, it would come to symbolize the beginning of the end of the Soviet Empire. The origins of the Soviet-Afghan War lay in the complex and unstable politics of Afghanistan itself. In April of 1978, a coup by Afghan communists, known as the Sour Revolution, overthrew the country's president and brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, or PDPA, to power. The PDPA was sharply divided between two rival factions, Khalq and Parcham. The new regime, led by Nur Mohammad Taraki and later Hafizullah Amin, launched a radical program of land reform, secularization, and suppression of traditional and religious structures. These reforms were deeply unpopular, especially in the rural and conservative areas of Afghanistan. Armed resistance began to spread across the country. Within a year, the PDPA was facing a full-scale insurgency, with rebel groups collectively known as the Mujahideen taking up arms against the government. The instability alarmed Soviet leaders in Moscow. Afghanistan bordered the USSR's Central Asian republics, and the Kremlin feared that chaos and Islamic radicalism could spread across the border. In September of 1979, Hafizullah Amin seized power in a violent internal coup. His rule was seen by Moscow as erratic and potentially hostile, despite his nominal allegiance to socialism. Soviet intelligence believed that Amin might even be reaching out to the United States, a possibility that deeply unsettled the Kremlin. On December 24, 1979, Soviet forces began a large-scale military operation in Afghanistan. In a matter of days, they secured key cities, airports, and government buildings. Soviet special forces stormed the presidential palace in Kabul and killed Amin. He was replaced by Babrak Karmal, a Parcham faction leader who was more closely aligned with Moscow and had previously been exiled. The Soviets hoped that with a loyal leader in place and military support on the ground, the PDPA could stabilize the country. That hope quickly faded. Far from securing Afghanistan, the Soviet presence intensified the resistance. The Mujahideen viewed the Soviet troops as foreign occupiers and received growing support from abroad. The United States, under President Jimmy Carter and later President Ronald Reagan, began supplying arms, funding, and training to the Afghan resistance through covert operations. Countries such as Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and China also played major roles in supporting the Mujahideen. The CIA's Operation Cyclone became one of the longest and most expensive covert efforts in American history. The war soon settled into a brutal and grinding conflict. The Soviet army, trained for large-scale warfare in Europe, was ill-prepared for the mountainous terrain and guerrilla tactics used by the Mujahideen. Helicopter gunships and armored columns could seize territory, but they could not hold it. Mujahideen fighters would melt into the mountains or blend into local populations, making it difficult for Soviet forces to distinguish enemies from civilians. The toll on Afghan civilians was devastating. Villages were bombed, crops destroyed, and millions of people displaced. By the mid-1980s, over 3 million Afghan refugees had fled to Pakistan and Iran. Tens of thousands of civilians were killed, and the country's infrastructure was left in ruins. For Soviet soldiers, the war was demoralizing and deeply confusing. Many conscripts were young men from rural regions who did not fully understand the reasons for their deployment. They encountered a hostile environment, both physically and culturally. Letters home were censored, and the true scale of casualties was hidden from the public. Those who returned wounded or traumatized often found little support from the state. Back in the USSR, the government maintained tight control over information about the war. Officially, the mission was framed as international duty, a fraternal act of support for a fellow socialist state. Unofficially, frustration grew. Mothers began to ask questions about missing sons. Veterans began to speak quietly of atrocities and futility. As the war dragged on year after year with no end in sight, cracks appeared in the narrative. The war also had profound consequences for the Soviet economy. Military expenditures rose sharply, draining resources from domestic needs. The already struggling Soviet economy was further burdened by the cost of maintaining troops, equipment, and aid to the Afghan government. At the same time, Western countries imposed sanctions and curtailed trade, deepening the USSR's isolation. Internationally, the invasion of Afghanistan was widely condemned. The United Nations passed resolutions calling for the withdrawal of Soviet troops. The United States led a boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics, joined by over 60 countries. Even within the communist world, reactions were divided. China sharply criticized the invasion, and relations between the USSR and China worsened. Non-aligned countries viewed the Soviet action as imperialist and hypocritical. Inside the Kremlin, doubts about the war began to grow. By the early 1980s, some Soviet officials recognized that a military victory was unlikely. But the leadership, now dominated by aging conservatives such as Yuri Andropov and later Konstantin Chernenko, was unwilling to admit failure or reverse course. It was not until Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985 that a serious effort to end the conflict began. Gorbachev recognized the war as a political and military dead end. He referred to it privately as a bleeding wound. Under his leadership, the USSR began seeking a diplomatic solution. Talks with the United States, Pakistan, and Afghan resistance groups began in earnest. In 1986, the Kremlin announced a phased withdrawal. The following year, the United Nations brokered the Geneva Accords, which laid out a timetable for the departure of Soviet troops. By February of 1989, the last Soviet soldiers left Afghanistan, nearly a decade after the invasion began. The Soviet-Afghan War left deep scars. More than 15,000 Soviet soldiers were killed, and tens of thousands were wounded. The Afghan death toll reached into the hundreds of thousands. The war had failed to achieve its political aims and had severely damaged the USSR's international standing. Perhaps most importantly, the conflict exposed the limits of Soviet power. The image of the USSR as a disciplined, ideologically driven superpower was replaced by one of a flailing state trapped in a war it could neither win nor justify. The experience weakened the authority of the Communist Party and contributed to a growing sense among Soviet citizens that their leaders were not infallible. By the early 1980s, the Soviet Union was teetering under the weight of multiple unresolved problems. The long war in Afghanistan was draining the nation's resources and morale. The economy, long sustained by oil exports and central planning, was stagnating. The political system had grown rigid, with a leadership class that was aging and increasingly out of touch. What followed was a series of short-lived governments led by elderly men, none of whom could halt the USSR's deepening crisis. After the death of Leonid Brezhnev in November of 1982, there was cautious hope among some in the Soviet bureaucracy that new leadership might bring change. The man chosen to succeed him was Yuri Andropov. Former head of the KGB, Andropov had a reputation for discipline and intelligence. Despite his background in the security services, he was seen by some as a potential reformer. Andropov took office at a time when the Soviet economy was showing clear signs of decline. Growth had slowed to a crawl. Factories continued to produce goods, but their quality was poor and innovation was rare. State-run farms required increasing subsidies, yet still failed to feed the population without grain imports. A shadow economy thrived beneath the surface, filling the gaps left by the state's inefficiencies. Understanding the gravity of the situation, Andropov launched a modest campaign to improve labor discipline and fight corruption. He believed that absenteeism, poor work habits, and widespread bribery were sapping the strength of the Soviet system. Police began stopping people in the streets during work hours to verify employment. Managers were investigated, and a handful of high-profile officials were dismissed or prosecuted. While these efforts signaled a new tone from the top, they did little to address the structural problems underlying Soviet society. The command economy remained inefficient, and the bureaucracy resistant to deep reform. Furthermore, Andropov's time in office was short. He had already been in poor health when he assumed power, and by early 1984, his condition had worsened. On February 9th of that year, he died, having served for barely 15 months. The leadership once again faced the challenge of choosing a successor. Instead of selecting a younger, more dynamic figure, the Politburo chose Konstantin Chernenko, a longtime party loyalist and close associate of Brezhnev. Chernenko was in visibly poor health when he took office. His speeches were delivered in a weak voice, often read by others on his behalf. He made no significant policy changes and largely preserved the status quo. Chernenko's brief tenure lasted just over 1 year. He died in March of 1985. For the third time in less than 3 years, the Soviet Union held a state funeral for a general secretary. The country had become a nation led by funerals, each broadcast with solemn music and long lines of aging officials paying their respects. It was not lost on the public that their leaders were becoming a symbol of the system's decay, unable to respond to modern challenges, and increasingly disconnected from everyday life. The string of elderly, short-serving leaders created a vacuum of authority and direction. It also revealed the deeper problems of the Soviet political system. The absence of genuine political competition meant that leadership transitions were decided behind closed doors, often based on loyalty rather than vision or ability. The average age of the Politburo remained high, and most members had been in power for decades. Few had fresh ideas or experience beyond the narrow confines of the party structure. Meanwhile, the Soviet economy continued to deteriorate. Oil prices, which had provided much-needed revenue during the 1970s, began to fall. This reduction in income came at a time when the USSR was spending heavily on defense, subsidies for allies, and the ongoing war in Afghanistan. Industrial output became increasingly disconnected from real needs. Factories produced according to quotas, not demand, leading to warehouses filled with goods no one wanted while shortages persisted in basic consumer items. The planning system, once praised for mobilizing resources during industrialization and war, had become a web of inefficiency and waste. Managers avoided risk. Innovation was punished rather than rewarded. The system lacked incentives to improve performance or respond to changing conditions. State investment favored heavy industry and defense, while housing, healthcare, and consumer goods were neglected. Demographically, the Soviet population was also facing serious issues. Birth rates were declining in the European parts of the USSR, while Central Asian republics experienced population growth. Life expectancy for men began to fall, due in part to widespread alcoholism and inadequate health care. Public health statistics were rarely released, but the general decline in well-being was widely felt. Hospitals were underfunded and medicines were in short supply. Socially, there was a growing gap between official propaganda and lived reality. The state continued to portray the USSR as a thriving, just society leading the world in progress. But Soviet citizens stood in long queues for basic items, endured overcrowded apartments, and watched as their leaders praised outdated slogans. Cynicism replaced belief. Jokes about the party, the economy, and the leadership circulated widely in private conversations, even as public dissent remained dangerous. In the cultural sphere, underground expression continued through samizdat and foreign broadcasts. Though official censorship remained strong, more people were tuning into Western radio stations such as Radio Liberty or the BBC Russian service. These broadcasts provided alternative perspectives on world events and introduced Soviet citizens to ideas that were never discussed in state media. In the republics, national tensions were simmering just below the surface. While Moscow maintained firm control, dissatisfaction was growing in the Baltic states, the Caucasus, and parts of Central Asia. These regions had distinct languages, cultures, and historical grievances which were never fully resolved under Soviet rule. The centralized model of governance allowed little space for regional autonomy or cultural recognition. By 1985, it had become clear to many within the Soviet establishment that the system needed change. The economy was weakening, public morale was low, the legitimacy of the party was eroding, but change required leadership and courage. The gerontocratic model had run its course. That year, for the first time in decades, the party selected a relatively young and energetic figure to lead the country. Mikhail Gorbachev, born after the Bolshevik Revolution, became General Secretary of the Communist Party in March of 1985. At 54 years old, he represented a new generation, one that had not been directly shaped by the trauma of Stalin's purges or the Second World War. He spoke of renewal, modernization, and the need to address the growing crisis. In March of 1985, following the death of Konstantin Chernenko, the Soviet Communist Party made a choice that would shape the final chapter of the USSR. For the first time in decades, the leadership selected someone markedly younger, more energetic, and more forward-thinking. Mikhail Gorbachev, at just 54 years of age, became General Secretary of the Communist Party. Unlike his immediate predecessors, he was not a relic of the Stalinist era, nor was he beholden to the rigid orthodoxy that had paralyzed Soviet governance for so long. Gorbachev's ascent marked a generational shift within the party. Born in the early 1930s, he had come of age during the war and matured politically under Khrushchev. He was a trained lawyer with years of experience in agricultural administration and party management in the Stavropol region. By the time he reached the Politburo in the early 1980s, Gorbachev was already viewed as a rising star. Foreign leaders, particularly in Western Europe, noted his charisma, pragmatism, and unusually open demeanor for a Soviet official. Upon taking office, Gorbachev inherited a country in profound trouble. The economy was stagnant, the bureaucracy was bloated, public confidence in the system was eroding. Internationally, the Soviet Union was burdened by the fallout from the war in Afghanistan and a deteriorating relationship with the West. Gorbachev's challenge was not just to improve the system, it was to save it. From the outset, Gorbachev signaled that change was coming. He spoke of restructuring and acceleration, using the Russian words perestroika and uskorenie. These were not just rhetorical flourishes. In internal meetings, he pushed for economic reform, administrative streamlining, and greater responsiveness within the party apparatus. He acknowledged, at least privately, that the Soviet economy was inefficient and the political system too slow to adapt. One of his first moves was to bring in a new team. Gorbachev began removing aging officials and replacing them with younger, reform-minded figures. Men like Alexander Yakovlev, Eduard Shevardnadze, and Nikolai Ryzhkov rose to prominence. These appointments signaled a clear departure from the old guard and introduced new thinking into the highest levels of Soviet governance. Gorbachev also understood the importance of communication. He presented himself as a leader willing to engage with the public. His speeches were more conversational, his tone less mechanical. He visited factories, farms, and universities, speaking with workers and citizens directly. This shift in political style was not merely symbolic. It reflected a deeper effort to reconnect the government with the Soviet people. Despite the enthusiasm for change, Gorbachev quickly discovered the immense difficulty of reforming a deeply entrenched system. The command economy, while theoretically efficient on paper, was in reality plagued by waste, poor planning, and corruption. Efforts to accelerate industrial production met resistance from managers who had little incentive to take risks or deviate from long-established practices. To break this inertia, Gorbachev launched a campaign to combat alcoholism, which had become a major social and economic problem. The Anti-Alcohol Initiative, introduced in 1985, raised prices on vodka, limited store hours for alcohol sales, and destroyed vast quantities of vineyards. While well-intentioned, the campaign had mixed results. Alcohol consumption briefly declined, but so did government revenues from alcohol taxes. Black market production of alcohol increased, and many citizens resented the restrictions. More broadly, Gorbachev's economic reforms aimed to decentralize decision-making and introduce elements of self-management into enterprises. The idea was to give factories and farms more autonomy in setting production goals and managing resources. But without true market mechanisms or legal frameworks to support these changes, the results were inconsistent. Some sectors improved, while others floundered amid confusion and bureaucratic obstruction. Recognizing the limits of purely economic reforms, Gorbachev turned increasingly to political change. He introduced the concept of Glasnost, or openness. Initially, Glasnost referred to increased transparency within the party and government institutions, but it soon evolved into something far more transformative. Under Glasnost, restrictions on media and public discourse were gradually lifted. Newspapers began publishing stories about corruption, environmental disasters, and historical injustices. Topics that had long been taboo, such as Stalin's purges, the Katyn massacre, and the Chernobyl cleanup, entered public discussion. Intellectuals, artists, and historians took advantage of this new freedom to explore the darker corners of Soviet history and society. This openness unleashed a flood of criticism, curiosity, and creativity. Bookstores featured titles previously banned. Films addressed themes of alienation, war trauma, and moral ambiguity. Television programs invited debate and questioned official narratives. Soviet citizens, long accustomed to silence or whispers, began to speak openly about the country's problems. But with greater openness came greater scrutiny. Citizens began to question not just recent policies, but the foundations of the system itself. Why had the truth been hidden for so long? Why had dissent been punished? Why had the economy failed to deliver on its promises? Gorbachev hoped that transparency would lead to renewal. In practice, it often led to disillusionment. Internationally, Gorbachev also began reshaping Soviet foreign policy. He sought to reduce tensions with the West, particularly the United States. Meetings with American President Ronald Reagan, once unthinkable during earlier Cold War peaks, became central to his diplomatic efforts. In a series of high-profile summits in Geneva, Reykjavik, Washington, and Moscow, Gorbachev and Reagan negotiated arms reduction agreements and built a personal rapport that helped thaw decades of hostility. The most significant result of these talks was the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, signed in 1987. It marked the first time the two superpowers agreed to eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons. The treaty was not only a military milestone, but also a political one, showcasing Gorbachev's willingness to take bold steps in redefining global power relations. Meanwhile, within the Eastern Bloc, Gorbachev's rhetoric and reforms began to unsettle long-standing assumptions. Leaders in Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany noted that Moscow was no longer enforcing rigid conformity. The so-called Brezhnev doctrine, the idea that the USSR had the right to intervene in socialist countries to preserve communism, appeared to be quietly abandoned. Gorbachev did not initially intend to dismantle the Soviet Union or abandon socialism. His goal was to modernize, to make the system more flexible, humane, and responsive. But in loosening the restraints that had held it together for decades, he unleashed forces that were increasingly beyond his control. By the late 1980s, the contradictions within the system were becoming more visible. Economic performance remained uneven. Party hardliners resisted reforms while liberals called for faster and deeper change. Nationalist sentiments, long suppressed, began to resurface in the republics. Strikes, protests, and public debates became more frequent. When Mikhail Gorbachev introduced the term Glasnost in the mid-1980s, He likely did not foresee the depth and scale of change it would bring. Translated as openness, Glasnost was originally conceived as a policy of administrative transparency, part of Gorbachev's broader reform program to revitalize the Soviet system. But almost immediately, Glasnost began to evolve into something far more powerful, a social and cultural awakening that challenged the very foundations of Soviet authority. Unlike earlier efforts at controlled liberalization under Khrushchev, Glasnost unfolded in an age of mass media and rising public discontent. It was not simply about reforming the mechanics of government. It was about unlocking decades of silence. For the first time in generations, Soviet citizens were encouraged to speak openly about problems in their society and to examine their own history without fear of reprisal. By 1986, newspapers and television programs began covering subjects that had previously been banned or censored. Official media outlets, under new editorial leadership, took bolder steps. Pravda, Izvestia, and Ogonyok ran investigative pieces exposing corruption, environmental disasters, and government mismanagement. Ordinary readers wrote letters to the editors by the thousands, sharing their grievances and demanding accountability. One of the earliest and most symbolic signs of Glasnost's potential came in the aftermath of the Chernobyl disaster in April of 1986. When the nuclear reactor exploded in the Ukrainian town of Pripyat, the initial government response was secrecy and denial, consistent with past Soviet practice. But as the scale of the catastrophe became undeniable, Gorbachev faced a stark choice: continue to suppress information or allow some level of public disclosure. He chose the latter. The disaster became a major turning point, not only for environmental policy, but for public trust. Citizens realized that decades of state lies and censorship had endangered their lives. Encouraged by the shifting political climate, writers and historians began revisiting the darkest episodes of Soviet history. The Stalinist purges of the 1930s, once mentioned only in whispers, became the subject of new research and public debate. Mass graves were uncovered. Former prisoners of the Gulag published memoirs. People who had long carried private memories of repression found a new language and a new audience to share their experiences. One of the most widely read publications of the era was Novi Mir, a literary journal that published works by authors previously banned or ignored. In its pages appeared fiction and non-fiction that challenged the official narrative of the Soviet past. Books such as Anatoly Rybakov's Children of the Arbat and Varlam Shalamov's Kolyma Tales reached large audiences. The fiction of repression now became acknowledged history. Museums and memorials to Stalin's victims began to appear in cities across the Soviet Union. Human rights organizations emerged, including the still small but growing Memorial Society, which aimed to document political repression and advocate for justice. These efforts were grassroots, led by citizens rather than the state, but they were tolerated, at least for a time, under the new atmosphere of openness. The cultural thaw extended into the performing arts. Theater directors staged plays that questioned conformity and explored moral ambiguity. Films addressed previously censored topics like the invasion of Czechoslovakia, the Afghan War, and internal corruption. One of the most influential films of the period, Repentance, depicted the fictional trial of a Stalin-like dictator and asked whether a society could truly heal without confronting its past. Though controversial, the film was eventually released and sparked intense discussion. Beyond culture and history, Glasnost also transformed how politics functioned, especially at the local level. Citizens began demanding more accountability from their elected representatives, and local newspapers exposed incompetence and abuses by party officials. In several cities, public meetings were held to discuss issues that had long been handled behind closed doors, such as housing shortages, environmental degradation, and industrial accidents. Nowhere was the spirit of Glasnost more visible than in the letters pages of Soviet newspapers. Readers flooded editors with stories of lost relatives, unjust trials, and bureaucratic absurdities. People who had been silent for years began to speak, and others listened. The Soviet people were not just receiving information, they were sharing it, shaping it, and demanding answers. But as the window of openness widened, the consequences became harder to control. Criticism that began as targeted and constructive quickly expanded into broader discontent. Questions about the Stalin era turned into questions about the entire Soviet system. Why had such atrocities been allowed to happen? Why had no one been held accountable? Why had ordinary people been forced to live under decades of repression and lies? Nationalities policy became another explosive issue under Glasnost. Ethnic tensions that had long been suppressed began to surface. In the Baltic republics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, historical grievances dating back to forced Soviet annexation during the Second World War were openly discussed. Citizens demanded historical recognition, cultural rights, and eventually political autonomy. In the Caucasus and Central Asia, similar movements began to take shape. Armenians raised the issue of Nagorno-Karabakh, a contested region within Soviet Azerbaijan. In Georgia, protests erupted over language rights and ecological damage. Even within Russia itself, voices began to challenge the centralized control of Moscow and call for a re-evaluation of national identity. The Soviet leadership struggled to respond. Gorbachev, while still committed to reform, found himself caught between rising public expectations and a deeply resistant party structure. Hardliners within the Communist Party warned that Glasnost was unleashing chaos, undermining unity, and encouraging nationalism. They pushed back against further openness, calling for a return to discipline and ideological clarity. Meanwhile, more radical reformers argued that Gorbachev was not going far enough. They demanded multi-party democracy, press freedom, and the complete abandonment of censorship. The once monolithic Soviet state was now being pulled in multiple directions, with no clear path forward. Foreign observers, particularly in the West, watched Glasnost with fascination. Western journalists were given more access to Soviet society than ever before. Foreign books and magazines circulated more freely. International human rights groups were cautiously welcomed. To many outside the USSR, it appeared that a democratic transformation was underway. But inside the country, the process was far more uncertain, uneven, and emotionally charged. By the late 1980s, it was clear that Glasnost had changed the political landscape irreversibly. The Soviet Union had moved from a society of silence to a society of noise, where debates, demands, and dissent filled newspapers, auditoriums, and city squares. But the state's institutions had not kept pace with this transformation. The Communist Party remained dominant, the bureaucracy largely unreformed, and the economy still centrally planned. As Glasnost deepened, it also revealed just how fractured Soviet society had become. There was no single narrative, no shared memory, and no agreed-upon future. Citizens no longer feared speaking their minds, but the system lacked the tools to meaningfully absorb and respond to their voices. Gorbachev had hoped that openness would build trust and strengthen the legitimacy of the state. In reality, it exposed long-standing wounds and fueled demands that reached far beyond his original vision. By the late 1980s, the Soviet Union stood at a crossroads. The policy of Glasnost had unleashed a torrent of public dialogue, criticism, and demands for transparency. But openness alone could not fix the most urgent and stubborn crisis facing the country, its economy. To address the chronic inefficiencies and stagnation, Mikhail Gorbachev launched an ambitious program of economic reform called perestroika, or restructuring. What began as a plan to modernize and revitalize the planned economy would soon evolve into a chaotic experiment with unintended consequences. The idea behind perestroika was not entirely new. Reformers had been calling for changes to the Soviet economic model for years, including limited decentralization, innovation incentives, and more efficient resource allocation. Gorbachev's predecessors had occasionally tinkered with the system, but the deeply conservative party leadership had always resisted anything that might threaten centralized control. Gorbachev, however, believed that superficial changes were no longer enough. He was convinced that without major structural reform, the Soviet Union would be unable to compete globally, meet domestic needs, or sustain public confidence. But unlike some of the more radical thinkers around him, he did not initially envision dismantling the command economy. Instead, he hoped to make it more dynamic while keeping its socialist foundations intact. In 1987, Gorbachev introduced a landmark reform, the Law on State Enterprises. This legislation gave factories and industrial enterprises greater autonomy in managing their operations. Managers were allowed to make decisions about production, wages, and supply contracts without direct orders from central ministries. In theory, this would increase efficiency by allowing enterprises to respond to real economic signals rather than arbitrary quotas. At the same time, a second major reform was introduced, the Law on Cooperatives. For the first time since Lenin's new economic policy in the early 1920s, the Soviet state officially sanctioned private enterprise in certain sectors. Small businesses, restaurants, service providers, and artisans could now operate legally as cooperatives. This was a dramatic break from decades of centralized economic control. The early results were mixed. In some cases, cooperatives thrived, offering goods and services that the state had long failed to provide. Entrepreneurs opened cafes, taxis, and repair shops. Consumers welcomed the availability and variety, even though prices were often higher than at state-run stores. But the success of these ventures also exposed deep flaws in the broader economic system. Cooperatives operated in a legal gray area with little oversight or clear regulation. Corruption spread quickly. Many cooperatives became fronts for black market activities or served as havens for party insiders and well-connected individuals who exploited their political ties for profit. As prices rose, ordinary Soviet citizens began to suspect that perestroika was benefiting the few at the expense of the many. Meanwhile, the reforms in state enterprises faced stiff resistance. Managers were unsure how to operate without detailed directives from above. They lacked experience in decision-making, budgeting, or responding to market signals. Workers, too, were confused by shifting expectations. In many cases, productivity did not improve, and output actually declined. Adding to the confusion, the central planning agencies still existed, and often issued contradictory instructions. The government was caught between two systems, the old command economy and the emerging market-oriented model. Rather than blending smoothly, they clashed. Supply chains were disrupted. Factories struggled to obtain materials. Coordination broke down. Inflation, a problem largely unknown in previous decades due to price controls, began to rise sharply. Food and consumer goods became scarcer, and prices in cooperative shops soared beyond the reach of average families. In some cities, bread lines stretched for hours. In others, stores stood empty despite increasing wages. The state's attempt to preserve social guarantees while liberalizing the economy only deepened the imbalance. The failure to stabilize the economy also had political consequences. Gorbachev's image as a reformer began to erode. Many workers, once hopeful that perestroika would bring prosperity, now blamed him for their declining living standards. At the same time, radical reformers and intellectuals criticized him for not going far enough. They argued that partial reforms could never work, that only a full transition to a market economy, including privatization and price liberalization, could rescue the country. This tension was reflected within Gorbachev's own government. The reformist wing, represented by figures such as Boris Yeltsin, pushed for faster and more decisive change. The conservative wing, including many long-serving Communist Party officials, resisted further moves toward decentralization and feared the erosion of party authority. Gorbachev tried to balance both sides, but the result was often paralysis. In 1988, the government attempted to introduce a new 5-year plan based on the principles of perestroika. But by this point, the planning system was unraveling. Ministries no longer had full control over production. Enterprise managers ignored directives. Republics within the USSR began asserting their own economic priorities, challenging Moscow's authority. The old mechanisms no longer functioned, and the new ones were not yet in place. To make matters worse, the Soviet budget was under growing pressure. Military spending remained high, and subsidies to state enterprises continued despite their declining efficiency. The oil market, a major source of Soviet revenue, experienced price drops. Foreign debt increased, and the ruble was not convertible on international markets. The USSR found itself in a fiscal squeeze, unable to finance both domestic reform and its global commitments. One of the clearest indicators of economic failure was the continuing decline in consumer satisfaction. Despite increased freedom in some areas, Soviet citizens still struggled to buy basic items. Soap, meat, sugar, and shoes were all in short supply in various regions. Even toilet paper became a symbol of dysfunction, with newspapers reporting on its chronic unavailability in major cities. In response to rising discontent, Gorbachev initiated efforts to modernize political institutions alongside the economy. New representative bodies were created, and limited elections were introduced for local councils and the national legislature. These steps were intended to give the public a greater voice in governance and to legitimize the reform process. But as political debate expanded, criticism of economic management became sharper and more public. By 1989, the Soviet Union was experiencing a full-blown legitimacy crisis. Economic performance continued to deteriorate. The party's control over public life weakened. Gorbachev remained popular abroad, winning praise for reducing Cold War tensions. But at home, his support was fading. The collapse of the economy under perestroika exposed the fragility of the Soviet system. For decades, the planned economy had hidden its inefficiencies behind propaganda and repression. Now, with reforms underway and censorship relaxed, the reality became clear. The system was not simply inefficient, it was unsustainable. While Gorbachev had hoped to preserve socialism through reform, he instead created a situation where neither socialism nor reform seemed to function. The hybrid model confused citizens, alienated bureaucrats, and disappointed workers. The ground was shifting, and no one, not even Gorbachev, could predict where it would settle. In the early hours of April 26, 1986, a sudden, violent explosion rocked reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. A column of fire shot into the night sky. The reactor's radioactive core was exposed to the open air, and the worst nuclear disaster in history began to unfold. For hours, the operators on duty did not fully understand what had occurred. Emergency responders, plant workers, and firefighters rushed to the scene with little to no protective equipment. They encountered a fire unlike any they had ever seen, one laced with invisible and lethal radiation. Within days, many of those first responders would be dead from acute radiation sickness. Thousands more would be exposed to doses far beyond safe limits. Despite the magnitude of the disaster, the Soviet government remained silent. Local officials delayed evacuation of nearby towns, including the city of Pripyat, home to nearly 50,000 people, most of them workers and their families. Only 36 hours after the explosion did the order come to evacuate. By that time, the children playing outdoors and the residents watching the strange glow in the night sky had unknowingly absorbed dangerous levels of radiation. For nearly 3 days, Soviet authorities did not release any information to the public. Life continued as normal in many parts of the country. In Kyiv, just 100 kilometers away, a parade for May Day was held as scheduled. Citizens were encouraged to attend, unaware that radioactive particles were drifting through the air. Only after Swedish monitoring stations detected elevated radiation levels and demanded explanations did Moscow acknowledge that a nuclear accident had occurred. Even then, the initial reports minimized the scale. The Soviet press referred to the explosion as a minor event and suggested that the situation was under control. It was not until Gorbachev addressed the nation in a televised speech nearly 3 weeks later that many citizens first grasped the severity of what had taken place. But by that time, trust in the state's honesty had already been severely damaged. The causes of the Chernobyl disaster were technical, procedural, and human. A late-night safety test had gone catastrophically wrong due to a combination of design flaws in the RBMK reactor and a series of critical errors by plant operators. But beyond the immediate causes, the event exposed deeper systemic failures: secrecy, poor communication, a culture of fear, and a bureaucratic reluctance to acknowledge mistakes. For Gorbachev, the disaster was a defining moment. Though he had launched Glasnost only months earlier, the state's initial response to Chernobyl directly contradicted its principles. Information had been suppressed. Local officials had acted with self-preservation in mind. Party bureaucrats had failed to act swiftly, and public health had been compromised as a result. Gorbachev later admitted that the disaster had played a major role in his growing conviction that openness was not just a reformist slogan, it was a necessity. In the months that followed, the Soviet government launched a massive cleanup operation. Hundreds of thousands of liquidators, soldiers, firefighters, construction workers, and volunteers were mobilized to contain the fallout. A concrete sarcophagus was constructed over the destroyed reactor to limit further radiation release. These liquidators, often working in hazardous conditions with limited protective gear, became the unsung heroes of the disaster. The cost of the cleanup and compensation was staggering. Economically, the state diverted vast resources to containment and relocation efforts. More than 300,000 people were displaced from the exclusion zone. Entire villages were bulldozed and buried. Contaminated land was abandoned. Long-term health effects, including increased cancer rates and psychological trauma, would continue to unfold for years. Politically and socially, the Chernobyl disaster shattered one of the key pillars of Soviet ideology: the belief in the infallibility of the system. For decades, the USSR had prided itself on scientific and technological prowess. Nuclear energy was a symbol of progress, modernity, and state control over nature. Now, that symbol had become a warning sign. The fallout from Chernobyl was not only radioactive, but psychological. Citizens across the Soviet Union began to view official assurances with suspicion. They questioned past cover-ups. They wondered what else had been hidden from them. The environmental damage, the human cost, and the lack of transparency struck at the heart of Soviet legitimacy. In the artistic and intellectual circles empowered by Glasnost, Chernobyl became a metaphor for everything that was wrong with the Soviet state. Writers, filmmakers, and journalists explored the disaster not only as a tragedy, but as a moral failure. Poems, documentaries, and reports chronicled the suffering of victims and the bravery of liquidators, contrasting them with the cowardice and incompetence of officials. In the republics most affected, Ukraine and Belarus, Chernobyl intensified calls for autonomy and national rights. Many locals blamed Moscow not only for the accident, but for the slow and negligent response. In Ukraine, environmental activism became intertwined with national identity. Demonstrations demanding transparency about the disaster evolved into broader political movements. Chernobyl also had international consequences. The Soviet Union, already under scrutiny from the West, now faced global criticism for its handling of the crisis. Western scientists and governments offered assistance, but the delay in acknowledging the accident had already damaged diplomatic trust. Foreign media coverage of the disaster contrasted sharply with Soviet silence, deepening the information gap between the USSR and the outside world. For Gorbachev, the disaster reinforced the urgency of reform, but it also highlighted the resistance within the system. Even as he pushed for openness, large segments of the bureaucracy remained steeped in secrecy and denial. Chernobyl revealed that reform could not simply be declared from above. It required a transformation of institutional culture and accountability. In the years following the disaster, efforts to address nuclear safety improved, but the damage to public confidence had already been done. Many historians now argue that Chernobyl marked the beginning of the moral and psychological unraveling of the Soviet system. While Glasnost had already opened space for public dialogue, it was Chernobyl that proved how dangerous silence could be. The disaster also demonstrated the limits of central control. In a system designed to suppress bad news and reward obedience, mistakes went unreported. Problems were hidden and corrective action was delayed. Chernobyl showed that the price of that silence could be catastrophic, not just for those nearby, but for the entire country. By the time the Soviet public learned the full truth, it was too late to restore the old narratives. Faith in the system had been broken, not by foreign propaganda, but by lived experience. the damage was not just to the environment or the economy, but to the collective psyche of a people who had long been taught to trust their leaders without question. By the late 1980s, the cracks in the Soviet Union were no longer just ideological or economic, they were also national. While Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms had begun as efforts to revitalize socialism, they inadvertently opened the door for suppressed national identities to re-emerge with force. Across the Soviet republics, long-buried grievances, cultural pride, and historical memories rose to the surface. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Baltic states and the Caucasus, where independence movements rapidly evolved from cautious expressions of identity to organized demands for sovereignty. The Soviet Union had always presented itself as a union of equal republics, but in practice, power was concentrated in Moscow. Local identities were allowed only within tightly controlled cultural boundaries. Expressions of political autonomy, historical revisionism, or linguistic pride were treated with suspicion or outright repression. Generations of Russification policies, coupled with centralized economic and administrative control, had left deep resentment in many non-Russian republics. In this context, Glasnost and perestroika acted like an accelerant. As censorship eased and local governance reforms were introduced, nationalist movements gained new space to operate. Local histories were revisited, forgotten heroes were celebrated, songs, flags, and languages once suppressed reappeared in public. In the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, the desire for independence had never fully disappeared. These three republics had been annexed by the Soviet Union in 1940 following the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact between Nazi Germany and the USSR. For decades, Baltic exiles abroad and quiet dissidents at home had maintained that the incorporation of these states into the Soviet Union was illegal. Now, with Glasnost lifting restrictions on historical discussion, that claim re-entered the public arena. In Lithuania, the Sonjudis movement formed in 1988 as a popular front advocating for national renewal. Though it began with cautious calls for reform within the Soviet framework, it quickly gained mass support for full independence. Tens of thousands gathered at rallies, waving the banned Lithuanian flag and singing patriotic songs not heard in public since the pre-war years. Latvia and Estonia experienced similar surges. In Riga, the Latvian Popular Front organized demonstrations that drew massive crowds. Estonian nationalists formed Ravarina, calling for greater political autonomy and language rights. These movements were not driven by narrow elites. They included intellectuals, students, factory workers, and rural communities. They drew strength from both cultural pride and a deep frustration with Moscow's economic control and demographic policies, especially the influx of Russian-speaking migrants into their cities. In a moment of coordinated defiance, the Baltic states staged what became one of the most striking peaceful protests in Soviet history, the Baltic Way. On August 23, 1989, the 50th anniversary of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, around 2 million people joined hands to form a human chain stretching over 600 kilometers from Tallinn in Estonia to Riga in Latvia and Vilnius in Lithuania. The message was clear. The Baltic peoples had not forgotten their history, and they were now demanding a future on their own terms. In response, Moscow tried to strike a balance between repression and negotiation. Gorbachev, wary of using force after the backlash of Chernobyl and committed in principle to democratic reforms, resisted hardline calls for military intervention. Yet he also insisted that the unity of the Soviet Union must be preserved. He proposed new constitutional frameworks for greater autonomy, but for many in the Baltic states, the momentum had already shifted toward full independence. Meanwhile, in the Caucasus, nationalism took on a more volatile and sometimes violent character. In Armenia, one of the oldest Christian civilizations in the world, the population had long harbored grievances related to cultural suppression and historical trauma, including the memory of the Armenian genocide and tensions with neighboring Azerbaijan. In 1988, Armenians launched mass protests demanding the transfer of the Nagorno-Karabakh Autonomous Region from the Azerbaijan SSR to the Armenian SSR. Nagorno-Karabakh was a majority Armenian enclave located within Azerbaijani territory, and the population there overwhelmingly identified with Armenia. The call for unification triggered immediate backlash from Azerbaijan, sparking ethnic riots, counter-protests, and eventually violent clashes between communities. This crisis, one of the first major interethnic conflicts of the perestroika era, revealed just how fragile the Soviet model of national unity truly was. Moscow, unprepared and unwilling to take decisive sides, floundered. Attempts to mediate only deepened distrust. What had begun as a demand for administrative change quickly spiraled into an intractable ethnic and territorial conflict that would outlast the Soviet Union itself. In Georgia, another republic with a long and distinct national identity, demands for independence also began to take shape. Protests in Tbilisi in April of 1989 ended in tragedy when Soviet troops used force against demonstrators, killing more than a dozen and injuring hundreds. The crackdown shocked the nation and transformed previously cautious reformers into outspoken advocates of sovereignty. Throughout these republics, the central themes were similar: historical injustice, cultural survival, and a desire for self-determination. These were not spontaneous uprisings, but the culmination of decades of frustration. What made this period different was that the Soviet state no longer had the ideological authority or coercive capacity to silence them entirely. In other republics, particularly in Central Asia, nationalism took different forms. While full independence movements were slower to emerge, there were growing demands for cultural rights and control over local resources. In Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and other republics, resentment toward the dominance of Russian language and culture simmered beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to rise. The explosion of nationalist sentiment across the Soviet Union placed Gorbachev in an impossible position. His reforms had empowered local voices, but now those voices were demanding separation. The institutions of the Union, its ministries, planning agencies, and internal security, were not equipped to manage a voluntary transformation of the empire. The Communist Party's traditional instruments of control were eroding, and new democratic institutions were too weak or too fragmented to replace them. Efforts to develop a new union treaty that would allow republics greater sovereignty within a looser federation stalled amid rising demands for full independence. While some leaders were willing to negotiate autonomy, others, particularly in the Baltics, made it clear that the time for compromise had passed. Gorbachev hoped to preserve the Soviet Union as a renewed confederation of equal republics. But he faced pressure from all sides: hardliners in Moscow who feared national fragmentation, reformers who sought full democratization, and regional leaders who no longer saw Moscow as a legitimate center of power. By the close of 1989, the world witnessed a geopolitical upheaval unlike anything seen since the end of the Second World War. Communist regimes across Eastern Europe, long held in place by Soviet power and the threat of military intervention, began to fall one after another. What had been a rigid bloc of authoritarian states aligned with Moscow was unraveling at astonishing speed. For decades, these regimes had seemed immovable, propped up by Soviet tanks, secret police, and the ideological weight of the Cold War. But now, in a matter of months, the map of Europe was being redrawn. At the heart of this transformation was a shift in Soviet foreign policy. For much of the post-war period, Moscow had maintained a clear principle: no Eastern European state could abandon communism or leave the Warsaw Pact without facing the consequences. This doctrine had been enforced in Hungary in 1956 and again in Czechoslovakia in 1968. But under Mikhail Gorbachev, that principle began to quietly dissolve. As early as 1988, Gorbachev made it known that the Soviet Union would no longer intervene militarily in the domestic affairs of its allies. He emphasized that each socialist country had the right to determine its own path. While Gorbachev hoped these nations would pursue their own reforms in line with perestroika, the message was unmistakable. The Red Army would not be marching to defend communism again. This shift emboldened opposition movements across Eastern Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity trade union, led by Lech Wałęsa, had survived years of repression and emerged as a major political force. In June of 1989, Poland held partially free elections, the first of their kind in the Eastern Bloc. Solidarity candidates won a sweeping victory. The communist government, facing pressure from the public and the Catholic Church, stepped aside peacefully. For the first time in over 4 decades, a non-communist-led government took power in an Eastern Bloc country. Poland's peaceful transition sent shockwaves through the region. If it could happen there without Soviet intervention, it could happen elsewhere. In Hungary, reformist communists had already begun introducing liberalization measures. That same summer, the Hungarian government dismantled the barbed wire fence along its border with Austria, effectively creating a breach in the Iron Curtain. East Germans, traveling to Hungary as tourists, now had a way to reach the West. Thousands began crossing into Austria and then on to West Germany. This flow of people would soon trigger the most dramatic moment of the entire process: the fall of the Berlin Wall. East Germany had long been one of the most rigid and controlled of the Soviet-aligned states. The Berlin Wall, erected in 1961, was both a physical and symbolic divide between East and West. Its presence stood as a monument to repression, designed to stop the flow of East Germans fleeing to the West. But by late 1989, mass protests were erupting in East German cities. Citizens demanded political reform, freedom of speech, and the right to travel. Faced with growing unrest, the East German leadership faltered. On November 9th, a government spokesperson, confused by the wording of a new travel regulation, announced at a press conference that East Germans could now cross freely into West Berlin. The news spread rapidly. That evening, crowds gathered at checkpoints along the wall. Border guards, unprepared and overwhelmed, eventually opened the gates. Thousands streamed through. Some climbed the wall. Others began chipping away at it. The wall that had divided a continent for nearly 3 decades was falling, not with violence, but with cheers and hammer blows. The images of East and West Berliners embracing, dancing, and breaking the wall piece by piece were broadcast around the world. The Cold War, as it had been understood for decades, was visibly ending. Elsewhere, the pattern repeated. In Czechoslovakia, a student demonstration in Prague in November sparked what became known as the Velvet Revolution, a series of mass protests that led to the peaceful resignation of the communist government by December. The dissident playwright Václav Havel, once jailed by the regime, became president. In Bulgaria, mass demonstrations forced the resignation of longtime leader Todor Zhivkov. Though the transition was less dramatic, the communist monopoly on power ended and reforms followed. In Romania, however, the collapse came with bloodshed. Nicolae Ceausescu, the country's hardline dictator, attempted to suppress growing protests with force. In December, after ordering troops to fire on demonstrators in the city of Timișoara, the situation spiraled out of control. Ceausescu and his wife attempted to flee but were captured. After a summary trial, they were executed on Christmas Day. Their deaths marked the violent end of one of the most repressive regimes in the Eastern Bloc. Throughout this period, Gorbachev remained committed to non-intervention. Despite criticism from Soviet hardliners who viewed the disintegration of Soviet influence as a betrayal, he refused to send troops. In doing so, he allowed history to take a different path, one without tanks in the streets of Warsaw or Prague. It was a bold and, to some, courageous stance, but it also exposed how little control Moscow now had over its former satellite states. The collapse of the Eastern Bloc had profound implications. For one, it marked the death of the Warsaw Pact as a viable political or military alliance. Without its Eastern European members, the Soviet-led bloc could no longer claim global parity with the West. The ideological facade of proletarian internationalism had crumbled. Soviet prestige, already weakened by economic crisis and internal dissent, suffered a final blow. More dangerously for Gorbachev, the changes in Eastern Europe sent a clear message to nationalist and reformist forces within the Soviet Union itself. Independence and transformation were possible. If East Germany could defy its regime, why not Lithuania? If Poland could hold elections, why not Ukraine? The rapid unraveling of Moscow's external empire now threatened to accelerate the disintegration of the Soviet Union from within. For the West, these events were viewed as a triumph of democracy and a vindication of Cold War perseverance. In Washington, London, Paris, and Bonn, leaders hailed the revolutions as a victory for freedom. Yet even they were surprised by the speed and scale of the collapse. In less than a year, regimes that had seemed entrenched for decades were gone. For Gorbachev, it was a double-edged sword. He was praised internationally for his restraint and his vision of a common European home. He received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1990 for his role in ending the Cold War without violence. But at home, he faced rising criticism from conservatives who saw the loss of Eastern Europe as national humiliation, and from reformers who believed he was too slow and too cautious in transforming the Soviet Union. As the Soviet Union edged into the final years of its existence, a new figure began to dominate the political landscape, one who would eventually challenge Mikhail Gorbachev, not just in popularity, but in power. Boris Yeltsin, once a loyal member of the Communist Party elite, transformed himself into a symbol of democratic opposition and Russian nationalism. His rise marked a decisive shift in the internal dynamics of Soviet politics, setting the stage for a confrontation between two competing visions of reform and of the Soviet future itself. Boris Yeltsin was not, at first glance, an outsider. Born in the Urals in the early 1930s, he rose through the ranks of the Communist Party as a construction engineer turned regional official. By the early 1980s, he had caught the attention of Mikhail Gorbachev, who admired his energy, directness, and apparent loyalty. Gorbachev brought Yeltsin to Moscow in 1985, appointing him as the head of the Moscow City Party Committee, the powerful position often informally known as the Mayor of Moscow. Initially, Yeltsin supported Gorbachev's reforms. He endorsed perestroika, spoke in favor of Glasnost, and criticized corruption and privilege within the party. But unlike Gorbachev, whose reformist instincts were tempered by a desire to preserve the Communist Party, Yeltsin pushed further. He called for faster, deeper changes and openly clashed with conservative members of the Politburo. He also distinguished himself by refusing the perks of high office, gaining public admiration for his modest lifestyle and confrontational style. In October of 1987, tensions between Yeltsin and the party leadership reached a breaking point. At a meeting of the Central Committee, Yeltsin criticized Gorbachev for not going far enough in his reforms and for protecting entrenched elites. The rebuke stunned the party. Shortly thereafter, Yeltsin was removed from his post in Moscow and effectively demoted. Many assumed his political career was over, but Yeltsin's downfall in official circles coincided with a dramatic rise in his public popularity. As Glasnost opened the media, ordinary Soviet citizens learned more about the internal divisions in the leadership. Yeltsin's criticism of privilege, inefficiency, and party hypocrisy resonated with a population increasingly disillusioned with empty slogans and declining living standards. He began to receive standing ovations at public appearances. Crowds gathered to hear him speak, and underground publications circulated his speeches. Rather than retreat, Yeltsin rebranded himself as a populist reformer. He positioned himself as the voice of the people, unafraid to challenge the bureaucracy or defy party orthodoxy. This new identity allowed him to re-enter politics, not through the Communist Party, but through the emerging structures of democratic participation that Gorbachev himself had helped to create. In the spring of 1989, the Soviet Union held elections for a new national legislature, the Congress of People's Deputies. It was the first time in Soviet history that voters had a real choice among multiple candidates. Yeltsin ran for a seat in Moscow and won in a landslide, defeating the official party candidate by a wide margin. His victory shocked the establishment and confirmed that he had become a force to be reckoned with. At the first session of the new Congress, Yeltsin's presence was electric. He used the platform to demand faster economic reforms, multi-party democracy, and greater autonomy for the Russian Republic. He challenged Gorbachev directly, accusing the leadership of betraying the promise of reform. The tension between the two men was now visible, not just behind closed doors, but on national television. The emergence of Yeltsin also highlighted a growing shift in political identity within the Soviet Union. Until this point, most political struggles had been between reformers and conservatives within the Communist Party. Now, a new divide was opening between the Soviet Union as a whole and the individual republics that composed it. Yeltsin increasingly identified himself as a representative of Russia, not just the Russian people, but the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest and most powerful republic in the USSR. He began to argue that Russia should not be subordinated to Soviet institutions controlled by unelected party officials. Instead, he called for Russia to assert its own sovereignty, manage its own economy, and determine its own political future. This message found fertile ground. In June of 1990, Yeltsin was elected chairman of the Russian Supreme Soviet, making him the de facto head of the Russian Republic. Just 1 month later, under his leadership, the Russian parliament passed the Declaration of State Sovereignty of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. While it did not declare full independence, the document asserted the supremacy of Russian laws over Soviet laws within the territory of the Republic. For Gorbachev, the implications were alarming. His vision of reform had always been built around preserving the Soviet Union as a unified, if more democratic, state. But now, the largest republic was openly asserting its independence. Worse still, the man leading that charge was a political rival who had once served under him. The power struggle between Gorbachev and Yeltsin became one of personalities, principles, and political strategies. Gorbachev remained committed to a gradual, top-down reform process that maintained the Communist Party's central role, at least temporarily. Yeltsin championed a more radical bottom-up approach, one that included privatization, a market economy, and multi-party democracy. This rivalry also reflected broader societal divisions. Gorbachev's base of support included parts of the intelligentsia, moderate reformers, and segments of the party apparatus. Yeltsin drew support from workers, students, and emerging democratic activists. His style, blunt, emotional, and confrontational, made him a polarizing figure, but also a powerful one. By the end of 1990, the Soviet Union was no longer governed by a single center of power. While Gorbachev remained president of the USSR, Yeltsin had effectively become the leader of Russia. The two men shared the same territory, but increasingly operated from different political universes. Yeltsin's rise signaled more than a personal challenge to Gorbachev. It marked the reawakening of Russian statehood as distinct from Soviet identity. For 70 years, Russia had been submerged within the larger Soviet structure. Now, under Yeltsin's leadership, it was beginning to act like a separate nation, with its own interests, institutions, and agenda. This shift further complicated Gorbachev's efforts to hold the Union together. As other republics declared sovereignty or moved toward independence, the Russian Federation's support became critical. But Yeltsin had little interest in saving the USSR in its current form. Instead, he saw an opportunity to build a new Russian state, freer, more democratic, and no longer dominated by Communist Party structures. The political conflict between Gorbachev and Yeltsin would continue to escalate, eventually reaching a dramatic climax in the months ahead. But already, the structure of the Soviet Union was weakening from within. The central government had lost its monopoly on power. The republics were asserting their independence. And a new political actor, bold, unpredictable, and widely popular, was preparing to rewrite the rules of the Soviet game. As the Soviet Union moved into the early 1990s, the economic situation rapidly deteriorated from stagnation to crisis. The lofty goals of perestroika had not been met with tangible improvements in daily life. Instead, the restructuring process had fragmented supply chains, eroded centralized control, and removed the few safeguards that had previously kept the system afloat. Prices surged, shelves emptied, and public frustration hardened into open anger. Across the country, people no longer asked if the Soviet economy could be saved. They asked how much longer it could survive. The The roots of this crisis lay in the contradictory policies of the late 1980s. While Mikhail Gorbachev had introduced limited market mechanisms, he had done so without creating a full market economy. Enterprises were given more independence, but price controls remained. Private cooperatives were legalized, but they operated within a chaotic legal environment. The result was neither a functioning planned economy nor a working market. It was a hybrid model that served neither producers nor consumers. By 1990, the consequences of this confusion were visible everywhere. The state distribution system, once clumsy but reliable, was breaking down. Previously subsidized goods now arrived late or not at all. In many cities, people lined up for hours in front of nearly empty stores. Items such as butter, soap, meat, and even bread became scarce. Some regions implemented ration cards to allocate basic necessities. In others, informal markets sprang up, where prices were far higher than official levels, but at least goods were available. Inflation, long suppressed by fixed pricing, now surged. As the government allowed some prices to rise in an effort to reduce shortages, entire categories of goods became unaffordable for ordinary citizens. Wages lagged behind, pensions lost value, and savings were eroded. For a population that had been promised stability and equality, the economic upheaval came as a shock. The Soviet promise of full employment and basic welfare had been replaced by uncertainty and anxiety. This growing crisis was compounded by political fragmentation. As the republics declared sovereignty and began asserting control over their own economies, the centralized planning system effectively collapsed. Each republic set its own rules on trade, taxation, and resource allocation. Essential supply chains that once stretched across the vast Soviet territory were now blocked by new legal barriers, tariffs, or outright hoarding. Raw materials could not reach factories. Finished goods failed to arrive in stores. In Russia, Boris Yeltsin and the Russian Supreme Soviet began taking control over key economic functions previously managed by the all-union government. This included collecting taxes, regulating state enterprises, and managing natural resources. The weakening of the Central Soviet budget left the USSR unable to fund many of its institutions. State salaries, military wages, and pension payments were often delayed or unpaid. Corruption and profiteering thrived in this environment. With enforcement weakening and oversight inconsistent, black market operators and criminal networks took advantage of the chaos. Goods were diverted from official channels to private sellers. Bribes became a standard part of securing supplies or licenses. In some regions, powerful local officials operated with near-total autonomy, creating mini-fiefdoms that were accountable neither to Moscow nor to the local population. For everyday Soviet citizens, the impact of the economic crisis was felt most acutely in the home. Families rationed food, parents skipped meals to feed their children, medical supplies grew scarce, and hospitals struggled to operate. Public infrastructure, already worn down by decades of underinvestment, continued to decay. In rural areas, especially in Central Asia and parts of the Caucasus, poverty deepened at an alarming rate. In larger cities, long queues outside stores became a daily routine. People began sleeping in line overnight in the hope of obtaining scarce products. It was not uncommon for fights to break out in grocery stores or delivery points. Rumors about impending shortages would spread quickly, prompting panic buying. The social fabric of Soviet life, once held together by a sense of shared hardship and order, now frayed under the pressure of competition and scarcity. The psychological toll of this collapse cannot be overstated. For decades, the Soviet Union had prided itself on providing for its citizens, even in modest ways. Now, with basic necessities out of reach, many felt a deep sense of betrayal. Trust in government institutions plummeted. Surveys taken during this period showed a sharp decline in public confidence, not only in the Communist Party, but also in state media, law enforcement, and public services. Strikes and labor unrest, rare during earlier decades, became increasingly common. Miners in the Donbass and Kuzbas regions walked off the job, demanding better wages, safer working conditions, and political reforms. Factory workers, teachers, and healthcare employees followed suit. Protest marches filled the streets of major cities. Workers did not merely protest poor conditions, they questioned the legitimacy of the entire system. Adding to the instability was the lack of a clear plan for economic reform. Within Gorbachev's administration, debates raged over how far and how fast the country should transition to a market economy. Some advisors urged gradual reforms to protect vulnerable populations. Others, inspired by the liberalizing policies in Eastern Europe, called for immediate shock therapy, rapid privatization, deregulation, and price liberalization. Gorbachev, cautious and politically constrained, struggled to choose a definitive path. Meanwhile, Boris Yeltsin and his allies in the Russian government began crafting their own economic program, independent of Gorbachev's policies. They argued that Russia must take control of its own future, break from the old command system, and implement radical reforms. The competition between the Russian Republic and the Soviet center further paralyzed decision-making. Western governments and financial institutions observed the situation with concern. While many supported Gorbachev's political reforms, they were reluctant to provide large-scale economic assistance without clear direction. Some aid arrived in the form of food shipments, technical support, and loans, but it was insufficient to stabilize the spiraling economy. For ordinary citizens, the presence of Western food in stores often highlighted the state's failure to meet basic needs. As the crisis deepened, Soviet citizens increasingly turned away from ideological explanations. The slogans of socialism no longer inspired confidence. Instead, people looked for practical solutions, often aligning themselves with local leaders, emerging political movements, or alternative sources of stability, be it religious institutions, regional networks, or even informal economies. By the end of 1990, the Soviet economy was effectively in freefall. Industrial output declined, inflation accelerated, and the government could no longer guarantee food supplies or public services. What had once been a superpower with a command economy was now a fragmented collection of republics, each struggling with its own version of collapse. By the summer of 1991, the Soviet Union was teetering on the edge of collapse. Political authority had fractured between the Kremlin and the Russian Republic. The economy was in crisis. Popular confidence in the Communist Party had evaporated. In the midst of this turbulence, one final, desperate attempt was made to reverse the course of history. A coup led not by revolutionaries, but by hardliners from within the Soviet establishment. Their goal was to halt the disintegration of the Union, suppress reform, and restore centralized control. What followed was 3 days of uncertainty, defiance, and a turning point that would end not just the coup, but the Soviet state itself. The coup was organized by a group of senior officials known as the State Committee on the State of Emergency. Among them were high-ranking figures from the KGB, the military, and the Communist Party, including Gennady Yanayev, the Vice President of the USSR, Valentin Pavlov, the Prime Minister, Boris Pugo, the Interior Minister, and Vladimir Khrushchev, the head of the KGB. These men believed that Mikhail Gorbachev had gone too far in his reforms, that he had lost control of the country, and that the proposed Union Treaty, scheduled to be signed in a matter of days, would dissolve the Soviet Union into a loose confederation. The treaty would have granted sweeping autonomy to the republics, allowing them to control their own resources and foreign policy. To the hardliners, it represented the final nail in the coffin of Soviet power. In their view, action was urgent and necessary. On August 18, 1991, with the treaty signing imminent, the conspirators made their move. While Gorbachev was vacationing at his dacha in Foros, Crimea, he was effectively placed under house arrest. Communications were cut. Security personnel loyal to the conspirators surrounded the compound. Gorbachev was presented with an ultimatum: declare a state of emergency or step aside. He refused. The following morning, August 19th, Soviet citizens awoke to a startling announcement. The media reported that Gorbachev was ill and unable to carry out his duties. In his place, Vice President Yanayev assumed power as acting president. Tanks rolled into Moscow. Troops took up positions at strategic sites. State television broadcast martial music and repeated statements from the newly declared State of Emergency Committee. A curfew was imposed. Political parties and newspapers were banned. It was a coup in all but name. But almost immediately the plot began to falter. The conspirators appeared unprepared for the scale of resistance they would face. Their public appearances were awkward and unconvincing. Yanayev, when addressing the press, visibly trembled, his hands shaking as he read from a script. Rather than projecting strength, the coup leaders looked uncertain and illegitimate. The most crucial challenge came from within Russia itself, led by Boris Yeltsin. As president of the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, Yeltsin was not under arrest. From the Russian White House, the seat of the republic's government, he called on citizens to resist the coup and defend democracy. In a now iconic moment, Yeltsin climbed atop a tank outside the building and addressed a crowd of thousands. His speech was broadcast around the world. Calm, defiant, and confident, he condemned the coup as unconstitutional and illegal. Yeltsin's call to action sparked a mass mobilization. Ordinary citizens began gathering outside the Russian White House to protect it. They built makeshift barricades, brought food and supplies, and stood watch through the night. Muscovites who had once lived in silence and fear now stood openly against a return to dictatorship. Elements of the Soviet military began defecting to the side of the resistance. Soldiers refused orders to storm the building. Some units turned around entirely. The resistance quickly spread to other cities. Across the USSR, local leaders condemned the coup. In Leningrad, now increasingly referred to as St. Petersburg, once again, Mayor Anatoly Sobchak rallied opposition. In the Baltic states, leaders declared support for Gorbachev and accelerated their independence movements. Even within the bureaucracy, many officials hesitated to support the coup, sensing that it was poorly organized and politically untenable. By August 21st, the momentum had shifted completely. The coup leaders, seeing their plan unravel, attempted to negotiate and withdraw. That evening, Gorbachev returned to Moscow. The coup had lasted barely 72 hours, but its impact was irreversible. Though Gorbachev resumed his formal position as president of the USSR, real power had shifted decisively to Boris Yeltsin. The Russian government now acted with growing autonomy, and Yeltsin emerged as the defender of democracy and national sovereignty. His image standing on the tank became the defining photograph of the new era. In the days that followed, the consequences of the failed coup unfolded rapidly. The Communist Party, long the backbone of the Soviet state, was suspended in Russia. Party buildings were seized and documents were exposed. Public support for the party collapsed. Demonstrators tore down statues of Lenin. Regional governments declared independence or sovereignty. The fragile unity that Gorbachev had tried to preserve through reform was now dissolving in real time. The coup had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than restoring Soviet control, it had accelerated the disintegration of the Union. Republic after republic now demanded complete independence. The public no longer trusted the central government. Military commanders questioned orders from Moscow. The economic system, already in collapse, now operated with virtually no coordination. Gorbachev, once a symbol of change and possibility, returned weakened and politically isolated. He tried to restart the reform process, to salvage what remained of the Union, but it was too late. Yeltsin, confident and emboldened, moved quickly to assert Russian authority. He seized control of state television, security forces, and central bank institutions within the Russian Republic. The USSR still existed on paper, but its core functions were now either paralyzed or in the hands of the Russian government. The August coup marked a historic turning point. It was the last attempt by the old Soviet Guard to reassert control, and its failure marked the final collapse of Communist Party rule. In just 3 days, the illusion of unity, order, and continuity vanished. What remained was a federation of republics moving in separate directions, a weakened president with little authority, and a Russian leader ready to dismantle the very state he had once served. The failed August coup of 1991 shattered the last illusion of unity in the Soviet Union. With the Communist Party suspended in Russia and Mikhail Gorbachev weakened beyond repair, The republics that had once formed the pillars of the USSR moved swiftly to formalize their break from Moscow. What had begun as a cautious sovereignty movement evolved into a full cascade of independence declarations. In a matter of months, the Soviet Union ceased to function as a unified state. Not through a single act, but through the quiet and determined retreat of its constituent parts. The political landscape after the coup was fundamentally changed. Gorbachev returned to office, but his authority was hollow. He was no longer seen as the architect of reform, but as a man who had lost control of both the party and the union. Meanwhile, Boris Yeltsin, bolstered by his public defiance during the coup, emerged as the dominant political figure, not just within the Russian Republic, but on the broader post-Soviet stage. The Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, the largest and most powerful republic within the USSR, had already declared the supremacy of its laws over those of the Union more than a year earlier. Now, Yeltsin and his government acted with complete independence. Russian institutions seized control over key Soviet ministries, including the KGB, the central bank, and the media. In practical terms, the Russian Federation was now operating as a sovereign state. Seeing the collapse of central authority and the weakness of Gorbachev's position, other republics accelerated their own declarations of independence. Ukraine, the second most populous and strategically significant republic, held a special session of its parliament just days after the coup. On August 24, 1991, Ukraine officially declared independence from the Soviet Union. The decision was later confirmed by an overwhelming majority in a nationwide referendum held in December. The Ukrainian declaration sent a powerful signal. The dissolution of the Union was now irreversible. Belarus followed closely, declaring its independence on August 25th. Moldova acted the same day. Over the next several weeks, one republic after another broke away. Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Armenia, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan all declared independence before the end of September. Even Kazakhstan, long seen as one of the more cautious and Moscow-aligned republics, declared independence by mid-December. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, had already taken the lead earlier in the year. Their declarations were rooted in legal arguments that their incorporation into the Soviet Union in 1940 had been illegitimate. In the wake of the coup, their independence was finally recognized by both the Soviet government and the international community. Western powers quickly extended diplomatic recognition, and United Nations membership soon followed. Georgia, which had experienced violent unrest in the preceding years, had already declared independence in April of 1991, prior to the coup. The events of August simply hardened that stance. The Caucasus republics, long restless under Soviet rule, were now asserting full national sovereignty. These declarations were not just symbolic gestures. In each case, governments took steps to establish control over their own military forces, economic institutions, and borders. Soviet flags were lowered from official buildings and replaced with national symbols. New currencies were planned, diplomatic missions were renamed or reassigned. Constitutions were rewritten or reinstated based on pre-Soviet models. A legal and political process that would have once been unthinkable was now happening at breakneck speed. Even within the Russian Federation, there was a quiet withdrawal from the Soviet framework. On November 6th, Yeltsin issued a decree banning all activities of the Communist Party on Russian territory. State assets were nationalized under Russian, not Soviet authority. Moscow itself, the historic center of Soviet power, now housed a government that no longer recognized the legitimacy of the USSR in practical terms. One of the most significant blows came from within the Soviet military. As the central government weakened, so too did its command over the armed forces. Soldiers faced confusion about whom they were meant to serve: Gorbachev's nominal central government or the now sovereign republics that housed their units. In many cases, local commanders pledged loyalty to their republic's leadership, not to the Soviet Ministry of Defense. Armies that had once been unified under a single flag were fragmenting by allegiance and geography. Economically, the consequences were enormous. The ruble, still technically in circulation across the Union, began to lose value rapidly as inflation worsened. Without a central treasury or coordinated economic policy, hyperinflation took hold in several republics. Barter systems emerged in rural areas. In major cities, cash became increasingly unreliable as a store of value. Imports dried up, and basic goods became even scarcer. Amid this unraveling, efforts to save some version of a common structure continued, particularly by Gorbachev. He hoped to replace the old Soviet Union with a new voluntary union, a looser federation of sovereign states that would cooperate on defense, foreign policy, and economic matters. Drafts of a new union treaty had been circulating for months, and after the coup, Gorbachev proposed reviving the process. But the momentum had shifted too far. Yeltsin, representing the now dominant Russian Republic, had little interest in maintaining the union, even in a reformed shape. His government argued that the future lay in building an independent Russian state, not propping up a failed federation. Many republics echoed this sentiment. The idea of union had lost all political capital. It was seen as synonymous with oppression, stagnation, and crisis. In an effort to bring some structure to the rapidly changing landscape, the leaders of several key republics began meeting independently. In early December, leaders from Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus gathered in a forested retreat in the Belarusian region of Belovezha. Their discussions would lead to a formal declaration that the Soviet Union no longer existed and that it would be replaced by a new organization, the Commonwealth of Independent States. The events in Belovezha would soon bring a formal end to the Soviet experiment. But even before that declaration, the USSR was already gone in practice. The Union had no budget, no central authority, no functioning military command, and no shared purpose. It was a political shell, abandoned, hollowed out, and disconnected from the realities on the ground. For the citizens of the former republics, the experience was a mixture of liberation and confusion. Some celebrated the return of national sovereignty, the revival of language and culture, and the possibility of democracy. Others mourned the end of a familiar system, however flawed it had been. Economic hardship, uncertainty, and interethnic tensions loomed. But one thing was now clear. The Soviet Union, which had dominated Eurasia for nearly 70 years, was no longer a functioning state. In early December of 1991, the Soviet Union still technically existed. Its emblem still hung in government buildings, and its president, Mikhail Gorbachev, remained in office. Yet beneath the surface, its political, economic, and institutional foundations had already disintegrated. The Union republics had declared their independence one by one, and Boris Yeltsin's Russia was operating as a sovereign state in all but name. What remained was not a functioning federation, but the legal shell of a vanished empire. Against this backdrop, a quiet but momentous meeting took place in a remote forest in Belarus. The meeting would result in the signing of the Belovezha Accords, a document that did not merely symbolize the end of the Soviet Union, but legally and irreversibly confirmed it. It was, in effect, the final act of dissolution. On December 7, 1991, the leaders of three key republics, Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, gathered at the Belovezha hunting lodge, deep within the Białowieża forest in western Belarus. The setting was secluded, chosen deliberately to avoid both media attention and political interference. Representing Russia was President Boris Yeltsin. From Ukraine came President Leonid Kravchuk, newly elected in a referendum that overwhelmingly supported independence. Belarus was represented by Chairman of the Supreme Soviet Stanislav Shushkevich. Although this was not their first conversation, the tone and purpose of this particular meeting were unprecedented. None of the participants believed that the Soviet Union could be salvaged. The events of the previous months, particularly the failure of the August coup and the wave of independence declarations, had made that outcome unworkable. The question now was how to formally conclude the Union's existence and what, if anything, would replace it. After 2 days of negotiations, on December 8th, the three leaders signed the agreement on the establishment of the Commonwealth of Independent States. The document was blunt in its implications. It stated that the Soviet Union, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, no longer existed. In its place, the signatories proposed the creation of a new association, the Commonwealth of Independent States, or CIS. Membership in this new entity would be voluntary, and each state would retain full sovereignty and independence. The Belozhev Accords were unprecedented. They were not an act of rebellion against Soviet power. They were signed by the leaders of the very republics that had formed the USSR in the first place. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus had been the founding members of the Union back in 1922. Now, almost exactly 70 years later, they were signing its death certificate. The signatories informed Gorbachev of their decision shortly after the meeting concluded. His reaction was one of shock and disbelief. Although he had been aware of the collapsing situation, he had not been consulted about the meeting and had not given his approval. Gorbachev still hoped to preserve some form of union, a loose confederation perhaps with shared economic and security arrangements. But the Belozhev Accords made it clear that the republics had moved on. On December 10th, the Ukrainian parliament formally ratified the agreement. Belarus followed on December 13th. In Russia, the Supreme Soviet voted in favor of ratification on December 12th, with Yeltsin simultaneously announcing that Russia was withdrawing from the Soviet Union. This last act was particularly significant. With Russia gone, the Soviet Union had no administrative or political core. It was now a state in name only. Following the initial agreement, the leaders of 8 more republics met in Alma-Ata, Kazakhstan, on December 21st. They signed a declaration supporting the Belozhev Accords and confirming the establishment of the CIS. These republics included Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Moldova, and Tajikistan. Georgia and the Baltic states did not join, maintaining their paths as entirely separate nations. The Alma-Ata Declaration reaffirmed that the Soviet Union no longer existed and that each of the former republics was now fully independent. It also included an agreement on nuclear weapons, ensuring that strategic arms would remain under joint control for the time being and would eventually be dismantled or redistributed under international supervision. This clause was critical in calming fears, especially in the West, that the breakup of the Soviet Union might lead to a chaotic proliferation of nuclear arsenals. At this point, Mikhail Gorbachev remained the president of the Soviet Union in a purely formal sense. But he had no republics to govern, no army under his command, no treasury, and no legal structure to enforce policy. His position had become symbolic, a reflection of a state that had already ceased to function. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev addressed the nation in a televised speech. Calm and composed, he announced his resignation as president of the USSR. In his remarks, he expressed disappointment that the country had come to an end, but reaffirmed his belief in democratic values and reform. He explained that he had done all he could to preserve the Union through negotiation and compromise, but that the will of the republics had prevailed. As Gorbachev signed his resignation letter, the Soviet red flag was lowered from atop the Kremlin and replaced with the tricolor of the Russian Federation. The moment was quiet but historic. No declaration of war, no revolution, no foreign invasion, just a symbolic gesture that marked the end of an era. International reaction was swift. Governments around the world recognized the independence of the former Soviet republics. The United Nations accepted Russia as the legal successor state to the USSR, including its permanent seat on the Security Council. Embassies changed names, treaties were rewritten. Diplomats adjusted to a map of Eurasia that now featured 15 new independent states. For the citizens of the former USSR, the dissolution brought a mixture of relief, confusion, and anxiety. Some celebrated their newfound national independence. Others mourned the passing of a superpower that had once commanded global respect and fear. Most, however, focused on the immediate problems of daily life: economic instability, inflation, political uncertainty, and the collapse of social safety nets. The Belozhev Accords were not merely a bureaucratic document. They represented the peaceful end of an empire born in revolution, sustained by ideology, and undone by its own contradictions. Unlike so many empires before it, the Soviet Union did not collapse in fire or conquest, but in negotiation and quiet retreat. On the evening of December 25, 1991, the world watched as a quiet but profound moment unfolded in Moscow. The red flag bearing the hammer and sickle, the symbol of the Soviet Union, was lowered from the dome of the Kremlin for the last time. In its place, the white, blue, and red tricolor of the Russian Federation was raised. It was a moment without gunfire or grand speeches in Red Square, but its symbolism was unmistakable. The Soviet Union, which had once stretched across 11 time zones and stood as a global superpower, had come to an end. Earlier that day, Mikhail Gorbachev had delivered his formal resignation speech as president of the Soviet Union. Sitting alone at a desk in a modest office, he addressed the nation and the world through a televised broadcast. His tone was calm, measured, and reflective. He expressed pride in what had been achieved during his leadership: openness, reform, an end to political repression, and the dismantling of the Cold War divide. At the same time, he acknowledged the profound transformations that had overtaken the country and made his continued role obsolete. Gorbachev's resignation did not come with bitterness. He did not denounce those who had opposed him, nor did he claim betrayal. Instead, he spoke of the new realities: that the Soviet republics had chosen independence, that the centralized structures no longer existed, and that the people had moved on from the old system. His decision to resign, he explained, was rooted in the belief that political leadership must reflect political legitimacy, and that his position, once anchored in the Union, now had no foundation. With the stroke of a pen, he ended nearly 7 decades of Soviet governance. The office of the President of the Soviet Union was dissolved. The institutions of the USSR, its ministries, military command, planning bodies, and diplomatic corps, were now either dismantled or absorbed by the newly independent states. For Gorbachev, it was a deeply personal moment. He had devoted his career to reforming the Soviet system from within, not destroying it. He believed in the promise of socialism with a human face. His vision had always been one of a more democratic, more humane union, one that could adapt to modernity without abandoning its foundations. Yet in the end, the very openness he championed exposed the rot within the system. His reforms unleashed forces far more powerful and far less controllable than he had anticipated. The fall of the Soviet Union was not the result of foreign conquest or violent rebellion. It was the outcome of internal contradictions: economic stagnation, political rigidity, suppressed national identities, and a reform process that came too late and moved too unevenly. Gorbachev's resignation symbolized the final acceptance of these realities. As the Soviet flag descended, people across the former USSR experienced a wide range of emotions. For some, especially in the Baltic states, Georgia, and Ukraine, it was a moment of long-awaited liberation. National independence was not merely political, it was personal, cultural, and historical. In these places, the end of the USSR was greeted with public celebrations, renewed pride, and a sense of reclaimed identity. Elsewhere, the mood was more somber. In Russia and Central Asia, many citizens watched the events unfold with a sense of confusion or even quiet mourning. The Soviet Union, for all its flaws, had provided a sense of order, purpose, and superpower status. Its collapse left behind uncertainty, economic chaos, and questions about what would come next. Factories stood idle. Bank accounts lost value. Veterans, workers, and pensioners who had built their lives within the Soviet system were unsure of their place in the new world. In international capitals, the end of the USSR was met with a mix of relief and caution. For decades, global diplomacy had revolved around the US-Soviet rivalry. Now, the Cold War was over, but with it came the risk of instability. Western leaders scrambled to understand the new political map, to recognize new governments, and to establish relations with emerging states. The fate of nuclear weapons, especially those located outside of Russia in Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus, became a central concern. For Boris Yeltsin, now president of the Russian Federation, the moment was both a victory and a burden. He had played a central role in accelerating the collapse of the Soviet Union, asserting Russian sovereignty and delegitimizing Communist Party rule. Now he stood at the helm of a vast but fragile state facing monumental challenges. Russia had inherited the Soviet Union's permanent seat on the United Nations Security Council, its foreign embassies, and its nuclear arsenal, but it had also inherited its debts, its economic dysfunction, and its social fractures. The transition from the USSR to the Russian Federation was not seamless. In the months and years that followed, Russia would experience inflation, unemployment, political turmoil, and a deep identity crisis. But for the moment, Yeltsin had achieved what few thought possible: the peaceful exit from a 70-year-old superstate without civil war or external invasion. The legacy of the Soviet Union remains contested to this day. To some, it represents an era of repression, censorship, and failed economics. To others, it evokes memories of scientific achievement, social mobility, and national pride. The Soviet collapse reshaped the world, ending the bipolar order that had dominated global affairs since the Second World War. The final lowering of the red flag over the Kremlin marked not just the end of a government, but the end of a century-long experiment, one born in the fire of revolution, sustained by ideology and power, and undone by its inability to reform in time. It left behind 15 new countries, each charting its own course, and a generation of people forced to navigate a new reality. In the end, the Soviet Union did not fall in a blaze of violence. It faded in a quiet, symbolic act, one flag descending, another rising, signaling the end of one era and the uncertain beginning of another.